Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 6 Asian Americans at the Nexus of Racism, White Supremacy, and Colonialism. Nexus, by the way, means kind of the center or the connection. So, in this class, as you guys know, this is a class that's a hybrid between a history class and ethnic studies class. And so, some chapters are going to focus more on the historic timeline, others will be more on kind of themes you might find in the ethnic studies course. So this chapter, actually, chapter 6, is going to be shading at least parts of it into, it's actually a pretty good mix. The title and the first bit of this lecture will be more of an ethnic studies lens and how a professor or scholar who's specialized in ethnic studies, how they would focus on this topic. And then later on this, in this lecture, I'm going to put in more of what it would be like for as a historian looking at events. So, and hopefully also this lecture, unlike maybe one of the previous ones, I don't think it'll be too long. Try to shorten for you guys a little bit. So grab a pen and paper, get comfortable, and let's jump in. So here we go. So let's take a look here. So now the next two terms are all defined, which is white supremacy and settler colonialism. Both those are terms I want you guys to know, and let me give you guys just a little bit of background before we even get to those terms to help you a little bit. So both these terms or concepts are a way an ethics studies professor or scholar or student can look at certain issues. Now, historians may use these lenses as well, too, and certainly in some cases you absolutely would. But it's the way you analyze issues of race and society. It's the way you, as you study this topic, you try to have some coherent, logical way to look at it and to frame it in your own mind. Additionally, both these concepts, white supremacy and settler colonialism, the next two terms we'll be dealing with, they're concepts for those who use them, both kind of universal in their use and also more particular in ethnic studies in both contexts, that are based on a view that these are important ways to understand challenges both that historically, in this case, affected Asian Americans and currently as well. But my bad, not just Asian Americans, all groups for that matter, frankly. Whites, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, etc., etc. So these concepts of white supremacy and settler colonialism, both of these are a term or a concept that's used to describe a negative aspect, both in the past and oftentimes a current system that scholars believe is also currently functioning. Now, by the way, I don't get too deep into this, but these concepts are debatable, and how do you apply them exactly? There'll be a lot of conversations about that. So I won't go too deep in that for you guys, but in any case, but essentially saying these are concepts that help us understand what it's like to be a minority within a majority culture. Majority culture that historically be European focused, Western, again, that could be included the United States for that matter. Liberal means individual rights as conceived of in the kind of Western context. Capitalistic, that's the economic system. Judeo-Christian, Western classical thought, that's combining Judaism, Christianity with classical Greek and Roman thought. All those kind of pulling together into a general kind of European general conception of the world, how it functions. And people with that thought, how they look at different racial, cultural, social systems, and usually those minority systems are often marginalized, victimized, dehumanized by this majority in Western culture. Again, there's a lot there. Some of that's controversial, some of that's pretty obvious. I won't go too deep into that, but just kind of a little background for what's coming up. So the first term is white supremacy, and I imagine most of you guys are pretty familiar with it, but I do want to define it a little bit more specifically. It's not just a racism, although absolutely racism is a part of it. It has a more specific definition, so let's take a look what you mean by that. So, and this is from this definition I have for you guys, which is right here, is in the ADL. ADL means Anti-Defamation League. This is a Jewish organization primarily, who oftentimes, by the way, has been a victim of this mentality. That's where I got this definition. But this definition works well in other contexts too, not just the ADL or Anti-Defamation League. Scholars, I think, will be very comfortable with this definition too. It's a good one. So what is the definition of white supremacy? And again, you see these 3 parts to it, right? White supremacy is a term used to characterize various belief systems central to which are one or more of the following key tenets. So again, so it's not just like white racism, although it includes that, of course. But you guys see here in that. So the first one, white should have dominance over people in other backgrounds, especially where they may coexist. So the white person should be on top in this perception, white supremacy. Additionally, number 2, whites should live by themselves in a whites-only society. Again, that may or may not be, by the way, the case. For example, in the American South, prior to Civil War, the white community definitely wanted to control the black population, but also did not want the black population to leave, ironically. So they wanted to have their services, have them work for them. Obviously, and enslavement is the most obvious example of that. So they're not looking to actually eliminate them. But in some contexts, some white supremacists do look for that. They do want a white-only society, and that's their view, whites only. And then number 3, white people have their own, quote, culture that's superior to other cultures. Certainly white supremacists, probably nearly all would have that. They believe however they define like white culture, they'd view that as superior to all other cultures. And finally, number 4, white people are genetically superior to other people. And because that belief that they're genetically superior, ideology superior, then they should be the ones in power. They should be the ones running things. Their culture should be dominant. Now again, usually most of these are present when you use the term white supremacy, although some of these, for example, number 2 may or may not be there. So it's not just simply a racism, but there's usually a more elaborate ideology. I would say elaborate, but more multifaceted ideology behind it. For example, the idea that genetically superior, culturally superior, and that we should have dominance because we are superior. The Ku Klux Klan would be a very good example of that. We'll back up to that for a minute. If you want on that image there on the left, that shows a white supremacist image. This would be back actually before the turn of before the turn of the 20th century. Showing you in the middle, you see Anglo-Teutonic. Then you see what they determine Negro here on the right, and then you see Irishman on the left. And they would say, if you look at their skull shape, and they're very subjective, pseudoscience. Pseudo means not really science, but as they imagine science. But pseudoscience examination. This is the highly advanced human species, both, as I say, a Negro or the African and the Irish person. Both of them are on a lower level of civilizational development, not just civilizational, genetic Darwinian evolution, that both the Irishman and the African are on a lower branch of human evolutionary development. Thus, the white person, as they would say, Anglo-Teutonic, that'd be primarily, by the way, from Germany, England, etc., Western European, that they are genetically superior. They're more evolved in the Darwinian struggle. Now, by the way, that is complete pseudoscience, just to be clear. But that would be an example of a white supremacist, quote, genetic scientific look at the various races and seeing themselves, seeing themselves as the most evolved, the most civilized, the most sophisticated, etc. That is, by the way, certainly the Klan. Be very familiar with. You see the Klan there on the right. Certainly the Klan would see them, and the Klan would be a wonderful example. Why wonderful? I mean dark, deeply corrupted, cancerously evil organization. But the Klan is a very good example of what white supremacy looks like in practice, which believe in white people are superior and their version of religion, in this case, Protestant Christianity, although they certainly are not practicing the tenets of that faith in a complete form. But that's how they self-believe themselves. That whites are superior, and all the groups, Asians, any kind of other minority, Jews, Catholics, etc., all those should be either excluded entirely or at the very least under control by the white majority. And that'd be a good example of the Klan's about as a white supremacist organization. Okay, I think most of you guys are pretty familiar with that, but let's go on to another term that's quite popular, actually not quite popular, quite frequently encountered in ethnic studies, and some historians in some contexts will also use this. Other historians not so much, but some will. That's the term of settler colonialism. So what is settler colonialism? And I'll come back to the art here in a minute, but essentially it's a theory put more fairly recently, by the way. We're talking the last 20 years. About a couple scholars, Lorenzo Verancini and Patrick Wolf, both of those who are just happen to be scholars working in Australia, but both of them in the last 20 years have come up with this term they call settler colonialism. So what do they mean by that? Now you guys are pretty familiar with colonialism. What do they mean by settler colonialism? So essentially what that means is, and you can see my long definition there. You can maybe write your own shorter one if you feel comfortable with that. But essentially the idea that it's a form of colonization or a power system, actually really the same, in which, here we go. Maybe I should do that. I highlight this for you guys. So when you're taking notes, and you don't need to write all this down, but let me highlight that for you guys. That would help. Okay, there we go. So colonialism, according to the scholars Verancini and Wolf, essentially is a form of colonialism or power system which an outside nation or people settles and stays in a colonized nation or people, and over time seeks to dominate and or eliminate the indigenous people culture, be it through war, violence, economic, cultural domination, assimilation. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. So they would say an example of that would be the English arriving in Australia and seeking to dominate or eliminate the Aboriginal people of Australia. And it's not temporarily, right? The English don't plan to leave, and they have not left. Instead, they've settled and made Australia their home. And today, Australians going to be predominantly, as you guys know, of European stock. The Aboriginal community in Australia historically was pushed off their land, sometimes killed outright, marginalized, forced to assimilate, etc. So today, the culture of Australia is predominantly of an English European background, but transplanted in Australia, and it stayed that way. So the local indigenous culture, in this case Aborigines in Australia, although they're not all gone, thank God, but many of them, of course, did die through the violence, being pushed off their ancestral lands, the cultural domination they faced, the assimilation, etc. So all the Aboriginals, to some extent, still exist there, but they're a very tiny minority culture in the dominant colonial culture that has arrived, taking over Australia. The United States, in many cases, will be an example of that too, as you guys know, with the English and the Spanish and so forth arriving here in California, or in this case, whole United States, Canada as well, and gradually pushing off the Native American people from their land, marginalizing them, forcing them onto reservations, and becoming the dominant culture and making this their new homeland. So now this is opposed to, say, typical imperialism colonization, for example, when England colonized India. England colonized India, as we talked about in this class already, right? But England, although English colonization certainly profoundly impacted India, but the English were never able to supplant or become the dominant majority population and to simply marginalize or limit Indian culture. The Indian population was too large and eventually got their independence, although certainly, again, there's many effects from European colonization, in this case, English colonization of India. But today, you have a resurgence of Indian cultural identity and control. That would not be an example of settler colonization. It would be an example of colonization and imperialism, but not settler colonialism. For it to be settler colonialism, the arriving settlers or colonizers have to absorb the entire space, not leave, and become the dominant culture and continually to marginalize the minority cultures who ancestrally have lived there in that place. Does that make sense what we're saying? So I hope so. So obviously, clearly, this is a negative process of settler colonialism. By definition, is a term, as proponents say, of a negative process. Obviously, in this case, saying these minority cultures have been damaged, badly damaged. Their full humanity is not seen nor possible to pursue it historically because this new settler colonial hierarchy has been imposed on them because these massive newcomers have come. And now it's this new culture. It's their language, their religious beliefs, their cultural outlooks, their economic systems. Their whole belief system is now the dominant of the entire land. And the indigenous people who live there all along now are marginalized. Many of them are dead and struggling. And a good example of that would be these two photographs. Well, I say not two photographs. Only one of these is a photograph. The photograph on the right would be Chief Joseph, his family, which was taken in 1880, and that'd be an example of a family, in this case, a tribal unit of Chief Joseph being the victims of settler colonialism, in this case, the arrival of the English, and gradually beginning to absorb the entire United States and make it their version of English or American. And the indigenous people are either pushed out of the way or marginalized, or their voices largely ignored. Last thing I mention about this is ethnic studies professor scholar would argue settler colonialism is not a process simply ends and over with. It's kind of an ongoing system as they would see it. So it's not just that the Americans gradually conquered the whole continent and the Indians are marginalized and so forth. They would argue, yes, that happened, but settler colonialism is ongoing. And so as an ethnic studies professor, they would look for a way to reverse that by giving greater voice to indigenous voices, to minority voices, etc., who are in that settler colonial environment. And it's good for a citizen who lives in that environment to be aware of this system, to be conscious of the system, and to actively work to restore prominence, full humanity, full complexity to these marginalized communities that have been subsumed within this larger settler colonial culture, in this case, general American culture today. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, how you define this gets debatable, so I won't do too deep a dive into this, but let me show you a couple of maps we're talking about. So this map you guys see in front of you is actually made by a Palestinian organization. And again, they have a very specific view, so the map I'm showing you right here, there we go, that would not necessarily be agreed to by all scholars. This is just simply one perspective of what they see as settler colonialism. For example, on this map, you see the United States and Canada, both of them known for being the settler colonial population, but that means both of them are majority recent, we're talking 300, 400, 500 years, immigrant populations that become the majority population demographically. Doesn't mean the natives, of course, are all gone, but the majority culture, the majority racial demographic is predominantly from, in this case, a European origin. In that case, you see, for example, Australia and New Zealand, parts of South America, and in this case, Siberia. I mean, like Siberia, but there were ethnic people that lived there prior to the arrival of the Russians pushing far into Siberia. Whereas you see other parts, for example, Africa and Asia, that certainly experienced extensive, and other parts of America too, extensive colonization, but the numbers of the immigrants were never large enough that they became the majority population, even though, again, certainly nearly all of Africa and large parts of Asia, of course, were colonized by the Europeans, but never in sufficient numbers that that population became the majority, and that whole culture has been transformed, and minority groups there are simply a small minority. Another way to look at this too is showing nations in the world that have primarily majority European ancestry. Again, there's some overlap here, but of course that'd be, of course, the United States and Canada, parts of Russia, Australia, and New Zealand. These would be termed settler colonial situations, according to ethnic studies professor and some historians. So, all right. So with that in mind, let's talk a little further about this dangers of reductionist. No. So I think that term, it can be very useful to look at certain places, for example, Australia, in the context of our class. We'll get to that here in a minute. It can also be helpful to look at this as a framework to look at how this has impacted the Asian American community. Now, here's where it gets a little more complicated, why I hesitate for just a minute. So this is kind of one framework to look at, settler colonialism and how that's affected indigenous peoples. And there's no question that's a very useful concept to understand the trauma and loss of language, culture, community, ancestral land, etc., that many Native peoples have experienced in the United States, Canada, Australia, etc. It's very useful for that. But the danger is, but there's also other complicated systems taking place simultaneously. And so it's important to not rely solely on kind of one lens to look at the issue. For example, even the American context of colonization. Settler colonialism is a useful term, but there's also a lot of other things going on too. So it's not that we should not use settler colonialism or, for example, white supremacy. I simply say, there's other very important things taking place as well. So those terms are useful and we need to use them where appropriate. But keep in mind, you cannot just universally place them on all situations because in many cases they may or may not apply. So, for example, East Asia, Southeast Asia, with the exception perhaps a bit of the Philippines, but even not even totally there, none of those places, even though most of them experienced imperialism and colonization, most of them did not experience settler colonialism. So in the case of an Asian American history class, Asia for the most part did not experience settler colonialism, but they certainly experienced colonialism. That means rule by a foreign minority group, but that minority never became the majority demographically, which is kind of definition of settler colonialism. So in an Asian American history class, I'm a little bit careful using that term too loosely, applying it to the Asian American experience. Now, here's how it could be. You could say an Asian American immigrant from whatever place in Asia, when they arrive in the United States, you're entering into a settler colonial experience. But of course, America is also very pluralistic now in 2022. So it's not so simple. America is a quite pluralistic culture today. So it is a useful way to look at things. But again, there's many more factors that take place. It's not so simple anymore. But anyways, I hope that gives you a little idea of an interesting lens in which to look at the situation of America, in this case, for the context of our class, looking at what does settler colonialism mean for the Asian American experience. Now, if this is a class focused on the Native American experience, the settler colonialism term or concept would be very useful. Again, you need other concepts as well too, but very useful. Now, the Asian American experience largely is coming into a society that's already gone through the most dramatic transformation prior to the Asian American experience really starting in the United States. The vast majority of Asian Americans have come in the 20th century. When, again, by the way, a scholar would say that settler colonialism experience is not dead. It continues on, and I hear what they're saying. But when you enter as an Asian American, I'm not sure that phrase is going to have the most impact on your experience in the United States, with the exception of you are entering into a dominant white culture. So that's where you get some white supremacy, which we talked about earlier. That might come in more handy. Okay, so let me give you an example of a case study that shows how complicated it can be to simply apply just one kind of framework on the Asian American experience. So I want you to know these two guys. And in a word that you guys are probably familiar with, and I would too, but I had no idea the background until I read this in your textbook, which is Erica Lee. And also, although you guys are not using this one, but I was also using Madeline Hsu's Asian American history too. In any case, and that is a case of Chang and Ing Bunker, although that's not the original name, by the way. But these are two young men who are conjoined, who came as quite early Asian immigrants in the United States, became something of American celebrities, not something, were American celebrities, became American citizens, married American wives, Caucasian wives, and transformed themselves into the American experience. But they were born in Asia and did this quite early in the history of Asian immigration to the United States. And it's a very interesting, kind of complicated story of both their desire to make a new life for themselves, also, by the way, them also being taken and used. So there's a kind of a lot going on there. So in any case, let's get into that. So the term Siamese twins, by the way, refers to a common term referring to these two young men. Siam, in this case, referring to Thailand. So let's get into the story a little bit. By the way, here's a couple examples. On the left, that's an oil painting in them from 1836. And then on the right, it's a picture of the two conjoined brothers many years later, probably not too long before they died. Okay, there's some more examples. I mentioned them being celebrities because being conjoined as they were, as you see right there, that did make them very famous as an attraction. That photograph on the right, even though the quality of photograph is not the best, but that shows the two brothers with their two wives and several of their children. All right. So the story of Madeline Sue relates the story of these two famous immigrants to the United States in the story of what that took place. Now, the Siam part comes because they were born in Thailand. So we don't use that word too much these days, but historically, we not usually use the word Siam to refer to Thailand. So that gives the idea of a Siamese twins. That means, in today's term, it'd be from Thailand. Now, their ancestry is actually Chinese and Malaysian, so they're not ethnically, I suppose, in a sense, what we think of Thai, although, like a lot of countries, by the way, there's a lot of ethnic complexity that includes in Thailand. But anyways, their background is Chinese and Malaysian. They're conjoined by a ligature of skin that connects their two chests. So in that time period, there was impossibility of separating them. So now an American sea captain, who you don't need to know, his name was Abel Coffin, by the way, but heard of these two twins while in Thailand. They were 17 at the time. Decided that this would be a real money-making opportunity for him and coaxed their mother into letting them go and brought them to the United States. And then he toured extensively with the twins from 1829 to 1839. See a 10-year time period. Not just in the United States, but even taking internationally, going over to Europe, in this case, Great Britain. They made quite a bit of money in the process because obviously there's a certain level of fascination with this. Now, additionally, as you guys probably can imagine, there's also a bit of a freak show atmosphere to this touring as well, too. So the fact that they're Asian, the fact that they're conjoined twins, on the one hand, generated tremendous interest in them. And over time, actually, they allowed both the two brothers to become quite wealthy. But they're also being used, clearly, right? So again, there's a bit of circus atmosphere to this, even though they're not technically in a circus. But there's a bit of that atmosphere of being exotic, being other, being Asian, then also having an additional factor, which being conjoined twins. In 1839, the two of them decided they had toured enough and they made quite a bit of money in that time period, and they decided to settle in Mount Airy in North Carolina. Around that time period, they became U.S. citizens. Now, that's significant, by the way, because as you guys know from other lectures, oftentimes Chinese were not able to become U.S. citizens, and then you have laws put in the books that prohibit them becoming U.S. citizens. But take a look, this is in the 1840s. In that time period, the Transcontinental Railroad is not being built, not yet, right? So at that time period, there's so few Asians inside the United States, so few, that there has not been laws put in the book, nor is a big pressure campaign to prevent large-scale Asian immigration or Asians becoming U.S. citizens. So that's really had not become an issue yet. So ironically, them being here in the United States so early on, there's not a big pressure campaign. There's not a big generation of racism toward Asian immigrants that would have stopped them becoming U.S. citizens. So they became U.S. citizens. They married two sisters. They eventually fathered 21 children. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. So I mentioned where they lived, right? There's Mount Airy, North Carolina, and they settled there in 1839, if you're doing your mental math. Slavery still tragically had several more full decades to go before the Civil War would ultimately end it, and then the 13th Amendment. So having money, both of them bought slaves and settled down there and became in many ways Southern gentlemen living in a society despite their Asian ancestry that would have made them obviously clearly stand out, especially in that time period in the United States. They learned English quite fluently. In many ways were two American gentlemen, albeit obviously of Asian ancestry and a very rare specimen, the fact also they're conjoined twins. But lived there relatively comfortably. Civil War years, though, brought a lot of hardships. The two of them being in the South, they were pro-Confederacy. They were slaveholders. That made it even more complicated. Eventually, Civil War brought slavery to an end. The slaves, of course, are gone, but the fact that they had owned slaves and embraced slavery marked them in Northern eyes as problematic, and so their later tours didn't do so well because of a certain level of unhappiness with them. Now, there's much, much more to that story. But the fact that they saw themselves as Americans, their celebrity status afforded many aspects of mainstream American society that was oftentimes denied to other racial groups or minorities of the era. So in many ways, they did very well for themselves. But of course, there's a price to be paid for that. I mentioned kind of the freak show atmosphere to a certain extent that the two had to deal with in their tours. But then they married and had 21 kids. And in many ways, grew quite comfortable in the United States. Again, but within that strange matrix of being certainly quite different and then also having celebrity status with all the pluses and minuses that comes with that. Two brothers died in 1874. Their descendants, which today number into the 1500s, many of whom still live in North Carolina. Just a really interesting case of very early Asian immigrants coming to the United States, what that would be like for them, being treated as exotic others, especially because they're being Siamese twins. Again, term coined for the two of them. And their history and story. If you're curious to know much more about that story, there's some good books I'd recommend to you guys in front of you. You can see The Indispensable by Yannette Hung, which is fairly recent. And you see The Lives of Chang and Ing, Siamese Twins, by Joseph Andrew Orser in the book on the right as well too. If you're curious about what that would have been like, how these two Thai gentlemen, but again, their ancestors Chinese and Malaysian, how they made their way in the United States. Both of them are quite intelligent men. Eventually realized, for example, their tour manager was exploiting them, and they left and said, no, not being our manager, we'll be our own manager, not doing you anymore. We're tired of being used by you. So there's much more to that story, but it just shows you how the Asian American experience on an individual level has all kinds of nuances and complication. So to be careful having just some general perception of what that looks like. Every person of all races and groups, of course, is an individual, and their individual experience varies dramatically. Just a good example of showing the tremendous variety and diversity within the Asian American experience, what that looks like. In this case, probably the two first Asian American celebrities in the United States, the two brothers. Although arguably there's actually an earlier Asian American celebrity, but for the sake of our class, though, this will be a good example. So, all right, let's get down to another term that's important. We'll talk about this term, especially when we come back to World War II in a later lecture, but that's the term yellow peril. You definitely want to know this term, so make sure in your notes, highlight that. Let me get a drink. Okay, so what is the term yellow peril? What is the origin of this term? And I want you guys to have your pen and pencil, make sure you guys take some notes here. So, ironically, it was not coined in the United States, which I would imagine actually comes really out of Germany. This is pre-World War I Germany. One night in 1895, the German Kaiser means he's a leader of Germany, Wilhelm II, has a terrifying dream or nightmare. Now, according to him, in this dream, he sees this very ominous, terrifying scene of these beasts, dragons, symbols coming out of Asia and overwhelming Western Europe, overwhelming Christendom, and invading, destroying Christendom in Western European nations. Now, following this terrifying dream and feeling that this dream represents a real threat, not just a nightmare, but a real threat, Kaiser Wilhelm II authorized an artist to recreate at least an idea of what that dream was like. The piece of artwork you're looking right here is what that artist created based on the dream, nightmare, whatever, seen by Kaiser Wilhelm II. And in this vision, this artist's work, you see a Buddha here. It's kind of hard to see here, but there's a dragon right here emerging from East Asia with these ominous clouds and power, and you even see fire right here as they're coming to the West. And this shows a feminized version of European nations. You can see Great Britain standing right here, realizing that there's this great threat, a military threat, an immigration threat, a cultural threat coming from the East. It's going to overwhelm the West and destroy Christianity, Western values, Western culture, society. Then you see a holy angel there warning them, saying, you need to protect yourselves. You need to defend yourselves from this great threat, this yellow peril from the East. Now, what is the context for this? The context for this was just prior to this dream, Japan had become a modern, industrial, militarily powerful, and imperial nation, quite successfully and rapidly modernizing, so much so that in 1894-95, Japan was able to defeat China in what's known as the Sino-Japanese War. Now, why is that significant? Because it shows Japan has in many ways borrowed and then utilized and incorporated the technology of the Western world and made themselves very powerful combined with Japanese culture. So now remember, in the time period that the dream took place in 1995, most Asian nations are still grappling with trying to figure out what modernization looks like and struggling. They are modernizing, but definitely behind Europe. That'd be China, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. By the way, those are still colonized by European nations. But those Asian nations and peoples, or in this case, some cases, colonies, being quite a bit behind Europe. But there's a very notable exception, which is Japan. Japan has not been colonized. In fact, Japan has very quickly modernized, very successfully modernized, and gone to war with its Asian neighbor, in this case, China, and defeated them. Then on the left, that's Kaiser Wilhelm II, from a photograph taken in 1902, if you're wondering what this guy looked like. On the right, you see some Japanese artwork showing the Japanese military fighting against the Chinese military in the Sino-Japanese War. If you look closely here, you can see the Japanese militaries were in Western modern-style uniforms, whereas the Chinese here depicted here above this wall are still wearing much more traditional Chinese military uniforms. Thus showing the Japanese have rapidly modernized technologically, militarily, and they're dominating this war. Another piece to show you, this is another artwork from that piece of artwork from that war. In this case, recalling the defeat of the Chinese army by the Japanese army in 1894 during the Sino-Japanese War. And you can see Japanese generals and officers, again, wearing Western-style modern uniforms, and this taking the surrender of these Chinese generals who are still wearing very traditional Manchu or Qing dynasty military uniforms. Thus, in the eyes of the Japanese artists, showing the superiority, technological prowess, military strength, and imperial might of Japan. So remember that, look at the dates there. It was 1894-95 that this war took place. Kaiser Wilhelm II's dream, according to him, took place on 1895, following news of the Japanese triumph that shows Japanese technological, scientific, military skill. Shortly afterwards, about a decade later, Japan will also defeat Russia in 1894-95, furthering the arrival of Japan as a force to be reckoned with. So why is this important? Because this idea, and even this piece of artwork, by the way, will become quite influential in Europe and in America as well, of seeing this growing, looming threat from Asia, and in particular based on the recent military successes of Japan and the rapid modernization of Japan, above all seeing Japan as at the forefront of this yellow peril. So while other Asian nations might be part of that, it's really Japan, because they're so quickly modernized, become military strong. The fear is, could Japan go on to become even stronger and eventually attack Europe or the United States, and could be triumphant, in this case, wiping clean these classical Christian European societies and cultures, also in the United States. So what's this impact on the United States? Because again, this begins actually in Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II, but certainly Americans, many of them also reacted to this dream. As you guys know, already anti-Chinese sentiment had already been strong for decades by this time period. For example, the Chinese Exclusion Act 1882. So it wasn't that Asian racism was new to the American West Coast. That already, as you guys know, had been going on. But now this perception is Japan the next great threat. We've dealt with the Chinese threat posed by Chinese immigration with the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese laborers, etc. And we've dealt with that to some degree successfully among those who view this as a threat, obviously. But now this new arrival of yellow peril, there we go, is causing a lot of fear. And this is a new source, in this case, Japan. So shifting from viewing the Chinese as a primary Asian threat And by the way, I want you guys to know these things. So let me take a minute here. Let me highlight this for you guys so you can write this down. So the common thread attacking the Chinese tended to be that they see them as less hygienic. They're a dirtier race. The Chinese are not possible to become American citizens because they're so radically racially, culturally different. They're unassimilable. They'll never become Americans. They're also economic competitors for the American population. They drive down wages. They're a threat with their morals and their gambling dens and their opium smoking and their house of prostitution. You guys know the whole playbook of the anti-Asian feeling on the West Coast of the Chinese. So a lot of that now doesn't leave the Chinese, by the way, but shifts to the new threat they perceive with, in this case, Japan or the Japanese. Now, additionally, besides some of these things you see right here, which we applied to the Japanese, there's going to be some different ones applied to them, which is, again, there's no question Japan has modernized rapidly and quite successfully. So a new element comes in, which is the Japanese are actually more dangerous because the Japanese have those negative Asian aspects, but they're very smart, they're very capable, the military, the army is very good, they're very quick to adopt and use Western technology. So actually, in many ways, they're a greater threat than the Chinese were because China is still struggling as a nation. Whereas Japan seems to have turned a corner and they're neck and neck technologically, militarily with European and America. So now they're a bigger threat because of that new factor. So what that means practically here on the West Coast, there's strong anti-Japanese violence and political activism by a variety of groups. This organization here called the Japanese Korean Exclusion League was formed, again, focusing on the Japanese, but also a small but growing population of Korean immigrants who have come over as well, too, and trying to prevent any more immigration, and additionally to bar Japanese and Koreans from going to any schools, in this case in San Francisco. You see two cartoons right here. It says what San Francisco objects to, and you see some white kids right here, and then you see some Asian kids right here. And this is a racist organizations in San Francisco saying we want to make sure that the Japanese, or any Asian kids, but Japanese in particular, are segregated from our whites-only schools. Now, but they weren't white-only up to that point. The schools were actually mixed. But there's a push to have that happen. We want to have a white-only school. These Asian kids can go to their own school, but I do not want them going to our school. Now, it's not so easy because Japan was a nation that's doing quite successful. So, although the school board tried to pass rules and did pass rules to make segregation based on race mandatory, the U.S. government said no. And why the U.S. government say no? Because Japan, of course, is not like this. And Japan is a nation that is growing quite rapidly and has a certain amount of clout and respect. So the Japanese government objected to segregated schools in San Francisco. The U.S. government steps in to stop that. But while that stopped at the time, the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 is important. And it's an example of large-scale government support over time for the primarily West Coast American anti-Japanese racism. So the Gentleman's Agreement is an agreement between the United States government and the Japanese government. It's not an official treaty. That's why it's called the Gentleman's Agreement. It basically means both governments quietly shake hands and agree to abide by it, but basically it halts almost all new Japanese immigration in the United States. Again, the yellow peril looming in the background. Many people on the West Coast don't want any more Japanese immigration, and so the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 halts. Now, not completely, because Japanese men who have wives, parents, or children living in Japan, those family members are still allowed to immigrate to the United States. But no new non-family connected immigration is possible. Except, again, you get some visas for some Japanese students to study and so forth. But immigration to stay is largely stopped, again, with the exception of wives, parents, or children of Japanese who are living inside the United States. They are allowed to immigrate. But the idea of the yellow peril does not go away as it continues to percolate and play a major role in World War II, as we'll see in a later lecture. So I want you guys to know this too. Is the continuing tide of yellow peril fears and anger continues to ripple inside the United States. And so you have a whole series of thinkers and writers describing this. That book on the right and the one on the left. The book on the left is Yellow Peril in all his glory. And again, it was primarily focused on the Japanese, but that cartoon you see on the left is actually showing a Chinese person. This is responding to the Boxer uprising there in China. And so the yellow peril, although again, I'll primarily focus on Japan, but it could be used, frankly, for any Asian group that they see some kind of violent threat. Now, if you see this white woman who's been murdered by this Chinese firebrand, again, this would be in the Boxer Rebellion in China. It took place in that time period. But the American public is reading these things in the newspapers. And again, for quite a few Americans, they're attaching the concept of just general yellow peril to any kind of Asian immigration. The book on the right is similar to that. That came out in 1911 by G.G. Rupert. Again, worried that Christian civilization is at peril with this growing Asian threat to the United States. Two more books here. The Valor of Ignorance by Homer Lee and The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard. Now, The Valor of Ignorance by Homer Lee, that is primarily a worry about the military expansion of Japan. By the way, there's some real aspect. Japan was an imperial power in this time period. Japan would, for example, colonize Korea, then forcibly colonize Taiwan, and other places too. So Homer Lee's worry about Japan being a growing colonial power, on the one hand, is not all wrong. Japan was a growing colonial power, and they did very aggressively, and many ways brutally colonize Korea and Taiwan and other places in Asia, parts of China too. My wife being Korean, she would give you an earful about this. So Homer Lee is not writing primarily, would say, in the modern world be a racist attack on the yellow peril. He is primarily worried that saying Japan is growing, powerful, and imperialist, and militarily expansionist, and a threat. And to some degree, he's correct. I won't go all the way, but to some degree, no. By the way, there could be some racist elements in his book, but he's not wrong about saying that this is a big issue. But that book on the right, The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard, is a very different. That is a very racialized or racist depiction of where these other races, in this case, Africans, you can see an Asian man, in this case, kind of Fu Manchu style hat and mustache, threatening the larger world. And Lothrop Stoddard's depiction is the world needs to stay in its racial lane. So what does he mean by that? So he would argue, and there's a map from his book, he would say, these are the regions of the world that need to stay in their lane. So the areas you guys see there in red are predominantly whites. When he wrote this book. By the way, Native Americans probably would have liked that term, stay in your racial lane, say in the year 1492. But of course, Lothrop Stoddard's not going there, right? He's picking his start point for when nations should stay in their racial lane. He's starting that in the early 20th century. So in his mind, that means the United States, of course, Europe, Australia, so forth. These are predominantly white societies now, emphasis on now, and they should stay that way. Whereas other racial groups, again, should stay in their lane. So, for example, Africa, although it's, by the way, in the process of being colonized by European nations, but black Africans should stay in Africa. That's their indigenous home. They should stay there. People he calls brown, that's kind of a general term. They call people who kind of the Muslim world, but also into Asia as well, too. That's his reason here. He decided they should also stay in their North African, Middle East, into South Asian region. They should stay there. And then the East Asians, which he has here in yellow, should stay in East Asia. And each group should stay in its geographic lane. Now, ironically, it's a very racist argument because, of course, not surprisingly, you can guess which of these races he believes is the most developed, the most sophisticated. Yeah, don't hold your breath which race he believes is that one. He wants to keep them racially pure. But the irony, of course, is if his thought would have followed, say, several hundred years earlier or even more, all the indigenous peoples here of the Americas and Africa, the Middle East and Asia would have maybe avoided the pitfalls of colonization. But of course, that's not his emphasis. His emphasis is these groups are a threat to us, as you see in this kind of this scary cover, as he would perceive it, of these other inferior racial groups coming to Europe or coming to America and damaging it to prevent that. They need to stay in their geographic zones, and let our superior white European culture remain on top in our areas, would be Europe, the United States, etc. Now, the significance of this is, by the way, does not mean all Americans buy into this kind of thought. Fortunately, we're in a pluralistic nation. That's why I mentioned like a term like sort of colonialism. It's a very useful term, but you can't take it too far because America has always had a variety of thoughts on these issues. Not so simple. So not every American is reading The Rising Tide of Color by Lathrop Stoddard and giving his racist argument that stay in your racial lane geographically. Doesn't mean they're all buying into that, but it is influential. So certainly some Americans absolutely are, and of course these views impact the Asian community, because the idea of yellow peril or stay in Asia is going to certainly have a strong viewpoint among some populations inside the United States, and this could affect the Asian American community. Hence why I just mentioned the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907, and finally, because we're done with this lecture, Immigration Act of 1924, and let me highlight that for you guys. This one is more official. The Gentleman's Agreement is just kind of an unspoken agreement. The Immigration Act, though, is an official act of Congress signed by the president. In this case, signed by Calvin Coolidge. But this basically limits nearly all new Asian immigration. Now, again, it's focused on the Japanese, but the Gentleman's Agreement was not an official document. It's just basically what we're going to do best practices. But this now is an act of Congress to halt nearly all new Asian immigration. Again, it did not completely stop it. Again, if you are bringing over a wife, or children, or parents, there's a way to do that for the Asian community. But all new immigration from Asia is largely stopped in 1924. And again, not surprisingly, a lot of the arguments behind that are going to go back to yellow peril, and people reading things like The Rising Tide of Color by Lathrop Stoddard and similar books, or outlining this threat to the United States from this Asian community. And of course, to wrap all this up, of course this affects the Asian American community, right? So it means it's going to remain relatively small in numbers, and not just that, not no immigration, but also limits what you can do, because these views not simply are limited only to immigration, of course, but it means the Asian American community here is going to have a lot of limits placed on them by these same general views of yellow peril and even earlier racist attitudes to the Asian American community. Now, fortunately, again, they're not uniformly under this, but you would have many limits put in your way based on these racist conceptions of the Asian, race that's held by a significant number of Americans during this time period. All right, with that, we're going to stop right there. So we'll see you with the next lecture. Take care, and I'll see you with the next one, everybody. Take care, everybody.